It's no secret that with the Nintendo DS's massive widespread success, just about every developer at the time would try their hand at making a smash hit for the handheld, and for many, things would work out pretty well. Throughout the mid to late 2000s, a veritable renaissance of handheld games had gone into full swing. However, whether it be due to a lack of good marketing or just being overshadowed by all the other games coming out, not every high-quality game would receive the level of popularity they deserved. So while there's tons of these hidden gems that seriously need more attention, today I want to focus on one that I personally feel might be the best of them all. Hello everyone, this is the RPG Monger, and today I'll be talking about Solatorobo Red the Hunter. Released late into the DS's lifespan in 2010 and 2011, this action RPG shouldn't even really exist, all things considered, because in actuality, Solatorobo is a spiritual successor slash sequel to the 1998 PS1 game Tail Concerto, a game that's arguably even more unknown. Both taking place in the same universe, but not really having any plot connections for the most part, Tail Concerto is a pretty simple action RPG that's only around 6 hours long. And for a game that short, the story and characters are pretty nice, if a bit predictable at times. It's mainly the gameplay that wavers, with the overall controls for both combat and platforming leaning more towards clunky, especially later in the game. Though despite that, it was still a mostly pleasant game overall, with Tail Concerto breaking even with around 100,000 sales worldwide, but not surpassing the expected 300,000 sales. Normally, that'd be it. Yet another obscure game in a sea of games who met a similar fate. However, determined not to let this world and its characters disappear, the 10-year-long planning period of Solatorobo would begin. In this lengthy span of time, a small team of devs would hammer out the finer details of the game's concepts and characters to make sure they were as good as possible. Although, with the game continuously being rejected by every producer Solatorobo was proposed to, more and more it appeared all their passion for this game would ultimately amount for nothing. That is, until their decade-long planning period ended when Bandai Namco picked Solatorobo up. From the onset, it's abundantly apparent that this game was truly a labor of love, and that only becomes clearer the more you play it. In the actual game itself, many of the core ideas of Tail Concerto live on, just far more refined. For one, the combat focuses on the grabbing mechanic from Tail Concerto. In order to deal damage, you've got to pick up your opponent and throw them, or throw items around you at them. Once you've thrown them, there's a short window of time to grab the enemy again to perform a combo. If you grab them in the air, you're able to extend the combo by another attack, making for a decent bit of damage every time. And of course, there's some juicy customization too. Functioning a bit like another game's customization system, here you can boost attack, hydraulics, mobility, and the stat that doesn't matter. What's cool about this system is that along with leveling up increasing your health, the only way to make room for more customization pieces is by finding items while playing. This ends up serving as a really nice motivator to explore each area you find yourself in, forming a pretty satisfying gameplay loop independent of the story. And believe me, you can become absolutely broken if you know what you're doing. Attack and mobility are pretty decent, as becoming faster or stronger does nothing but help, but hydraulics are the real key to becoming overpowered. Remember how the combat revolves around picking enemies up and throwing them? Well, since hydraulics make picking things up easier, with enough hydraulics you can pick enemies up near instantly before they even have time to react. I swear, by the endgame, I'd maxed hydraulics out so much that I could spam early game bosses to death. Though as you can't pick up every boss, I tried to have a decent balance between attack and hydraulics. Honestly, the hardest fights in this game were bosses you can't pick up for that reason. As far as combat goes, it's nothing crazy or super challenging, but it's dynamic enough to be an entertaining partner to the real reason you're playing this game, its story. Not going into spoilers just yet, the setting, characters, and story of Solatorobo are the real strong suits of this game. Just visually, the areas all look so nice. Much like Tail Concerto, Solatorobo takes place across a variety of floating islands, each island containing unique features like a bustling city or a dense forest. Taking advantage of all the knowledge that comes with developing for a console late in its lifespan, the mix of 2D and 3D in these areas, and just in general throughout the game, make everything come to life much more fluidly. It's not very common that a DS game has me just standing still for a second in-game just to take in the surroundings. If there's one thing Solatorobo has, it's style. Alongside much of the game going for a general steampunk vibe, the overall setting of the game, the Shepherd Republic, was inspired by France and other European locales. So of course the logical thing to do is to then have all the little bits of voice acting in the game be completely in French no matter what version of the game you're playing. While at first when I started the game I thought I'd just messed up and started playing the French version of the game, I was pretty surprised to learn this was an intentional decision. And honestly, I seriously respect that. It's not every day that you have a group of developers so committed to setting a specific atmosphere that they make all voice acting the same across every release. Since I don't know the language myself, I can't speak on the quality of the voice acting with it being done by Japanese voice actors, but it all sounded pretty good to me. As a result of blasting through this game in under a week, it's kind of left me with a few French words embedded in my brain. Though it's not all style and no substance, the way you progress through Solatorobo is also pretty satisfying. In the game's world, our protagonist Red Savarin is a sort of freelance worker called a hunter. To get the job done, he and his sister Chocolat fly around between Sky Islands picking up all sorts of requests. So it'll come as no surprise that side quests are a very prevalent thing in Solatorobo. However, to call them side quests wouldn't exactly be accurate. While most of them don't really have much bearing on the plot, many are actually necessary due to them enabling you to take on future quests that aren't part of the main plot. Thankfully, these aren't your typical go do this mundane task type of side quests either. Along with the game almost always making sure each activity you do in a quest is different from the last, a lot of the time side quests will take place in exclusive areas made specifically for the quest. And in said areas, a lot of the time they're one of the best spots to find crystals for expanding the customization screen. As far as motivating the player to do these goes, putting this much effort and variety into side quests was some great game design. Plus, considering many quests will feature the same characters depending on the area they're in, it's a nice sneaky way to develop characters and get you attached to them. On top of all that, there's even some unique little mini-games you can unlock or do through quests. There's the portions where Red can fly around a ton of tiny sky islands, a fully fledged racing minigame, and one of the sickest fishing minigames I've played yet. While the racing one definitely takes some getting used to with how easy it is to get snagged on things, the other two are the best. After playing Tail Concerto and struggling to land on islands in its flying section, I was really happy to see they refined it here. And that fishing minigame is no joke. As opposed to most fishing minigames that tend to be more on the calm side, here you've got a match like your life depends on it. Once you manage to hook one of the various giant hermit crabs that are straight up using the wrecks of airships as shells, the game thrusts you into an intense game of tug-of-war as you mash A and switch the direction you're reeling according to the location of the hermit crab. Though be careful, it's really easy to get super focused on reeling the crab in only for your hook to overheat and let it escape. Of course, the type of hook and difficulty you select will affect how insane it is, but it's a seriously fun and rewarding minigame. It blew me away that they managed to fit all these things in next to the game's expansive story, which on that note, I can no longer avoid talking about. Now I know what you're thinking. Monger, is this French furry game really all that special like you're saying? Well, dear viewer, let me put it this way. While I've covered quite a few underrated games and series, none have been quite as underappreciated for how good they are like Solatorobo. So if you've trusted my recommendations in the past, believe me when I say you've got to play this game. Up until now, I've made sure to only show the beginning portions of the game without spoilers, so if you leave now and come back a week or so after beating it, you won't regret it. Though hey, I'd appreciate some likes and comments for some good old-fashioned engagement if you do. If you really want to go all out like I did, you can also play Tail Concerto before Solatorobo, as the latter does have returning characters and side content, but it's not necessary. Unless you're living in a future where either of these games have been re-released, I'd recommend you play these through your Windows DS. That is, unless you have a measly couple hundreds of dollars lying around. I'll give you all a second to go do that. Alright, all good? Well, for those returning after beating the game, those who don't care about spoilers, and the 10 people watching who actually played it already, I've got a lot to say about this game's story. Kicking things off with a bang as Solatorobo starts in the middle of a mission Red is undertaking, the beginning portion of this game does a great job at acquainting you with both its gameplay and characters. And from the very beginning, it's abundantly clear that the devs poured every ounce of quality they could into this game. Just look at all these animations! There's no doubt that Solatorobo had some of the best cutscenes on the DS. The way they managed to bring these characters to life through a type of 2.5D animation works really well, both in keeping the style of the game consistent and just in general staying within the DS's limitations. So as Red makes his way through the tutorial that is the airship Hindenburg, he comes across an amulet hidden away deep in the ship. Upon the amulet activating, the plot kicks into high gear, with it seemingly summoning a massive creature who then proceeds to take the Hindenburg down. Funny how both Solatorobo and the first Xenoblade game came out within months of each other. The Bionis clearly gets around. Though as the Hindenburg is coming apart, Red stumbles upon an unconscious boy amidst the wreckage. With everything crumbling around them, it's a pretty crazy start that, unbeknownst to me, would set the stage for practically everything to come. And speaking of setting the stage, to my surprise, following that would be a completely animated opening. I was already pretty shocked that such an unknown game like this looked as good as it did, but the fact that they got Studio Madhouse to animate for them blew me away. This opening theme is still one of the best tracks in Solatorobo. You'll start to notice that an ongoing trend with this game is, without fail, it keeps managing to top itself. However, after all that, this is where the game's style of progression is introduced, with the aforementioned system of side quests and plot segments. I love the little back and forths between Red and Chocolat. Next to all the regular gameplay Solatorobo has to offer, it's here that some extra collectibles are introduced. Much like how you find crystals to expand the customization screen, there's two other things you can collect while playing the game. There's various points where Red can interact with objects to unlock new songs in the sound player, and then there's my personal favorite, the Black Cats Gang. Returning from Tail Concerto and bringing with them one of that game's only side mechanics, throughout Solatorobo's areas you can find kittens from the gang hiding or roaming about. By catching them, you can get pieces of pictures you can view in Red's airship, the Asmodeus. It's by no means necessary to get all the pictures, but like the music collection and the crystals, it makes exploring around way more fun and worthwhile. In fact, the only other collectible type thing in this game is unlockable by simply playing the game. Once you gain access to the journal, its various entries become unlocked as you take part in more activities in the game's world, whether that be simply progressing through the game or breaking every item in sight. It's very much worth it too, because the little lore entries you get from it are all pretty interesting. Since one of my favorite things about Solatorobo from the get-go was its world of floating islands, this little feature was perfect for me. And yes, this game has lore, a lot of lore. More on that later. It doesn't take long for the plot to ramp up again, as the things that attack the Hindenburg proceed to attack the town Red's in as well. Though as Elle, the kid Red rescued from the Hindenburg, explains, they're actually born from that same massive creature that appeared earlier. While Red and Chocolat are pretty clueless as to why this is all happening, it becomes pretty apparent that Elle knows a whole lot more than they're letting on. Thus, after taking down some shades, Elle promises Red untold riches in exchange for his help with sealing that massive creature Laris away. For a segment that only encompasses the first hour or so of the game, Solatorobo's plot has some seriously solid foundations, and with its core characters firmly established, things begin to progress much more from here. After that initial arc, Solatorobo's story reuses a bit of the framework set by its predecessor, Tail Concerto. In that game, its protagonist Waffle was constantly trying to stay ahead of the antagonists by collecting these 5 crystals before they could. While only 3 crystals in Solatorobo, its antagonist Bruno and the massive Curvos Hunter Guild he leads are after these crystals in a very similar manner. The main difference is each crystal is protected by the mayor of the town they're located in, so the next few arcs all play out similarly. That's not to say they aren't good, however, as the game takes this time to really focus on character development. The way Elle is shown to bond over time with Red and Chocolat really made this early portion. Or well, in Red's case, maybe bonding might not be the correct term all the time, as he accidentally found out Elle wasn't a boy all along. So for the first crystal on the Sky Island of Spin-On, this was definitely one of the prettiest areas in the early game. Even with the DS's graphics, they managed to make this little Venice-inspired area look really pretty. In the town sewers where you fight the main boss of this chapter, Kahlua, this is also a perfect example of both the good and lacking parts of this game's combat. In this fight, Kahlua has two main attacks he'll do. There's a short-range sword attack that'll punish you for trying to pick him up in the front, and there's a long-ranged attack with his gun. These are both pretty great, as they encourage you to either get down the timing of catching his bullets and throwing them back, or always try to run around him to pick him up from the back. Plus, alternatively, after he attacks you, there's a period of vulnerability as well. The main issue is even with the limited customization you have at this point, you'll never take that much damage from most attacks. I get that the devs wanted the game to be approachable by anyone, but making it so that the punishment you get for going against the flow of the game mechanics be so minuscule kind of defeats the purpose of having said mechanics in the first place. If bosses could just damage you a bit more, it'd fix most of the inadequacies found here. It's for that reason that I didn't even bother adding defense boosters to my customization screen. The game is honestly more fun without them. That said, this doesn't ruin the combat for me, as it's still pretty enjoyable to outsmart enemy attacks. There's just not a lot of stakes most of the time. The fact that the combat remains fun throughout the game despite that saves it for me. For instance, with Kahlua, it was rewarding to find out that when you make him drop his gun by throwing bullets back, you can then steal his gun and shoot him with it. Though anyways, like I said before, the small dent that is combat in this game is entirely overshadowed by everything else, like this next segment for instance. After leaving Spin-On with the first crystal, Kurvos hunts the Asmodeus down and shipwrecks it in the Davrin Islands. Here, this is where that flying segment I mentioned is introduced, it all being really fun to zoom around and take down the Kurvos along the way. That victory doesn't last for too long, however, as a new character named Beluga steals the crystal back for Kurvos. On one hand, while this does kind of retread a plot point from Tail Concerto, it's much more significant here, since it leads to Elle actually warming up to Red and Chocolat instead of seeing them as a means to an end. Not to mention, this is where she reveals that both her and Beluga are the last survivors of a clan whose sole purpose was to seal Lara's away if it awoke once more. Now don't get me wrong, Red's carefree attitude and Chocolat's nagging make for great dialogue when you're out doing quests and whatnot, but it's moments like these that allow a window into their actual personalities that really make them shine. In the next chapter, this is a bit of a lighter one, with the crew visiting the sky island of Vizsla to fully repair the Asmodeus. What is worth mentioning here is Solatorobo introduces a new type of battle compared to the usual enemies. It doesn't happen that often, but sometimes there'll be bosses that can only be damaged by Red throwing other enemies or objects into them, and honestly, I feel like these fights are probably some of the best in the game. Normally, if you just pour a ton of hydraulics into the Dahak, you can pick up enemies over and over before they can really do much of anything. Though with these types of fights, you're forced to pay attention to the mechanics and take advantage of what throwable objects the game gives you, so thankfully bosses aren't always a cakewalk. Back to the crystal hunt in chapter 5 and 6, this one plays out kind of like the last one, with the exception of Red and Elle getting thrown in jail by the Kurvos for a short while. The little minecart portions they brought back from Tail Concerto were a nice touch. I know I was praising fights that focus more on throwing stuff at enemies before, but man, these weird mole things in Shetland are such a pain when you have to fight several of them. I love this cool feature of not being able to catch their rocks due to another one attacking at the same time. Then with these chapters' bosses, while Gren is just Kahlua with no gun and a better sword, their leader Opera is a bit more interesting. Being another boss you can't pick up, her laser attacks were probably the most challenging attacks at this point in the game. Overall, these chapters aren't the craziest compared to later ones, but they do their job well of getting you attached to the main cast. Moving on to the following one on the Sky Island of Basset, this is where the overall tone of the game begins to shift. Whereas until now, the story has been a pretty upbeat adventure across colorful locales, Basset is different from the get-go. In stark contrast to all the bustling towns and pristine nature on every island so far, the slums of Basset are made up of what's essentially a pile of rotting battleships from a long-concluded war. The people here clearly make the most of what they've got, with many being avid hermit crab fishers, but a somber atmosphere hangs over the entire town. In fact, what establishes that atmosphere more than anything is the track that plays here. This one in particular really stands out to me compared to all the other town themes in the game. You might think that's a pretty good song now, but trust me, it fits even more when you come back here later in the story. Like what happened when Beluga cornered Red, things go awry in much the same way when Red is forced to hand over the last of the crystals to stop the Curvas from destroying the orphanage at Bassett. It's a pretty bad situation, all things considered, that serves to set up this game's first real twist in the next arc. Now, before I continue covering the main plot, I want to take a second to mention a specific side quest here in Bassett. In general, I'm not going to talk that much about the side quests in Solatorobo, since while they're definitely good, especially those with returning Tail Concerto characters, I'd rather focus on the main story. Although when it comes to this one in particular, I just can't avoid commending it. It starts out pretty simple. Red has to help an amnesiac recover something from an old battleship wreck. The peculiar thing is when you get there, the flight logs on the wreck date back to 50 years ago. So going back to Galvin, who you got the quest from, in place of him is his son Calvin. Having apparently been brought there by a voice in his dreams, it turns out the entire purpose of this quest was to deliver Galvin's final words scribbled on the flight log to his son he was never able to meet before dying in battle. To make matters more depressing, the names Galvin intended for his child never made it back to his wife, his dying wish ultimately remaining unfulfilled. However, since Calvin is conveniently about to have a kid of his own, he'll carry on that wish by naming his child with the names intended for him. I don't know if it was the Bassett theme playing in the background or the shock of a side quest like this taking such a turn, but it kind of hit me more than I expected. There's really only been a few RPGs like this that have managed to do that to me through a side quest of all things. Serious props to the writer of this game. The depression doesn't stop here either, with Chapter 8 being the darkest one so far. Deep inside the Holy Land of Samoyed, a portal to the Holy Quarter has opened, a place where El can perform the rite of forfeit to seal away Laris before Bruno can use it. Except right before completing it, Beluga comes back. Along with having probably one of my favorite Solatorobo mechs, his fight is kind of an improved combination of both Gren and Kahlua, though it's not really the fight here that matters. In truth, once Beluga realizes what's happening, he reveals the rite of forfeit is actually a ceremony that requires a living sacrifice. In retrospect, it hits a lot harder when you think back to all the times in the story where Elle slowly but surely became more attached to Red despite knowing what she had to do to him. Even as she's trying to perform the rite, seeing her choke up at having to sacrifice yet another person she cared about was pretty heavy. With Elle and Beluga having been granted immortality just so that they can perform the rite of forfeit when needed, you can't help but feel bad for all the suffering the both of them have gone through just due to Laris. Whereas all the chapters until now had been laying the groundwork for this scene, it was here that I truly became attached to all these characters. And good thing too, as with the next chapter revolving around saving Elle who got captured by the Curvas so Red could escape, they couldn't have given more motivation to rescue her. Moving forward into the beginnings of the finale, the plot from here on plays out more or less predictably. After rescuing Elle, there's an actually solid boss battle for a change, with Opera, Kahlua, and Gren all fighting you at the same time. Not only being a bit more on the challenging side when it comes to fights in Solatorobo, it was really funny being able to just throw Opera's lackeys at her. Then in a reverse compared to the Rite of Forfeit, Bruno recites the Rite of Awakening, which much like the former, sacrifices the individual the amulet has chosen. Now of course, Red doesn't die here, but I swear, this whole part really is just the suffering arc of Elle. On a side note, I find it hilarious that according to a dev interview, the only reason Bruno's airship and attire is so Japanese-inspired is due to him being obsessed with the Japan equivalent in this world. I can't believe the main villain the whole time was just a massive weeb. No wonder he wants the big robot. All in all, with the exception of all the juicy character development with Elle, a lot of this plot so far is kind of just an improved version of Tail Concerto. From the one-dimensional villain to the conflict surrounding a gigantic world-ending mech, the parallels are all over the place. However, right when Red and Elle are about to confront Bruno from within Lares, things take quite an unexpected turn. Up until now, it's been well established that the world of Solatorobo is exclusively inhabited by cat and dog people. If anything, this has been established for 2 games now. So you can imagine my surprise when out of nowhere, Red spontaneously transforms into a human in the final battle. I guess they did vaguely hint at this in the opening, but what a crazy thing to include at the end. I will say, the way the Hawk transforms into gauntlets when Red is defurried does look pretty sick. And for the Bruno fight, things are fittingly more difficult. Though to be honest, a lot of the difficulty for me was just struggling to catch things in time and getting rid of the little laser shooting things. I'll take this over the final battle of Tail Concerto any day. That fight drove me insane after a while. Thus, with Laris's core taken out by Red and L, it seems like Solatorobo's story has come to a close. But wait, hold on a second, why is there still so much left in the video? And why was that little bit of dialogue before the credits so foreshadowing? Maybe there's just some more story in the postgame, right? With much of the story sharing plot beats with Tail Concerto, it easily had me thinking the game was just a better version of its predecessor. The characters were nice and the setting was great, but other than that, the story was just a bit above average at the end of the day. When I was sitting through the credits, these were the thoughts I had about the game as a whole. Little did I know that it was only now that the true story of Solatorobo was about to start. That's right, everything from the parallels to Tail Concerto to the general sense of finality the last few chapters had was all specifically engineered to trick you into believing the story was about to end. Out of all the RPGs I've played in my day, I'm genuinely not sure if I've ever been this thoroughly duped by a game. This has to be one of the most insane fake-outs. It's like you just finished watching a pretty solid show, only to find out a second season is already out and it's even better than the first. Because from the get-go, it appears the whole plot with Bruno was merely a vehicle to get you attached to the characters. Now, as the game shows a mysterious human figure, it's clear that there's much more to this game's world than meets the eye. Entering the second half of Solatorobo, we're shown a scene taking place 300 years before the main plot of the game. Here, some miners happen to uncover a mysterious relic from an ancient advanced civilization, a human emerging from it soon after. And as if to punctuate the massive amounts of confusion you're probably experiencing as you try to figure out what the hell humans are doing in this furry game, Solatorobo hits you with a new animated opening. You thought you had questions before? Nothing comes close to the amount of insane stuff shown in this opening. If anything, it served to make me extremely hyped to find out just where this game was going from here. Why are there people now? Was that another mech? What's going on? Never have I been so happy to find out a game had only just begun. Taking place a few months after Laris got destroyed, the story picks up with Red and Chocolat back in their usual routine. After some regular questing with Waffle chasing the Omega Tsundere, Red arrives at the Sky Island of Pharaoh. What with it being the capital of the Shepherd Republic, Pharaoh is a vast city full of all sorts of characters. Along with a few others, Pharaoh immediately became one of my favorites. I just really loved watching all the airships fly by as trains constantly go from place to place. It was times like these that made me almost forget I was playing a DS game. Which makes it all the worse when out of nowhere, both Laris and a new Titano Machina attack the city along with two new apparent humans. Serving as two of Solatorobo's new antagonists, Blanc and Nero are clearly demented, with them thinking nothing of attacking a helpless child. Though when it comes to their fight, it's nothing too difficult. Despite that, Red still ends up pretty badly defeated by the two, and from here, Solatorobo begins to drop a lot of information. Basically, Red, Blanc, and Nero are all beings called hybrids who are able to enter a form called a trance. And no, not of the Zidane variety. While in this form, they each gain a massive amount of power and transform into something resembling a human, Red only losing due to being inexperienced with this power. Back at the flagship of the Curvas, Red meets with Merveille, a character who aided him before after failing to thwart Bruno herself. According to her, Blanc and Nero's true goal is to summon a world-destroying force called Tartarus. So in order to close the gap between them and gain control over his trance, Merveille subjects Red to a series of simulations to make him stronger. Being quite the departure from the game so far, this whole segment takes a turn for the psychological. At first it starts out pretty tame with Red reliving some past moments, but then in the third simulation, things begin to get pretty dark. This time preying on his deepest fear of hurting the ones he loves, it's seriously heart-wrenching watching Red slowly realize that everyone is accusing him of going out of control and killing Elle and Chocolat. With how much Red has already been fleshed out up until now, it makes this whole portion hit much harder as you have to watch a usually upbeat character get worn down by every new simulation. And in the final simulation, things go completely abstract. You see, for whatever reason, Red has no memory of his life before he arrived at his orphanage 9 years ago, so to try and dredge up those memories, this simulation sends Red into his own psyche. Going into the depths of his fragmented memories, it becomes clear that Red's childhood was spent in a laboratory of sorts. In fact, not only was he there as a child, that was actually where he and every other hybrid were artificially created by both Merveille and the man behind the entire project. What a jump from the plot just being about going around collecting a couple MacGuffins. Considering that we were just shown that Red's greatest fear was going on a rampage just like Nero and Blanc, learning that they were all created together is a massive blow to his character. What's worse is Red was a failure of the project, only escaping death by fleeing the lab before he was killed off with the other failures. Understandably, this all sends Red into a depression as he questions the very nature of his being. Now, I'll admit, coming off of the first half of Solatorobo, I fully expected Red to be the kind of character who'd just be happy-go-lucky for the majority of the game. With how simple the plot was initially, there really wasn't much need for his character to grow past that. Though as the game's story expands, I was really happy to see them do more with Red and give him a proper arc outside of saving those around him. This next segment where Red copes with and accepts who he is was honestly one of the best parts of Solatorobo. Back at the orphanage in Bassett, Chocolat aims to have Red remember who he really is by having him spend time in a place similar to where they both grew up. After all, the real Red wasn't the experiment created in a lab, it was the Red who became Chocolat's brother in their orphanage. And as if right on schedule, when Red was finally able to smile again, Nero shows up in a mech of her own. To be able to fight her in the first place, this is where Red gains access to a new, stronger version of the Dahak, various new gameplay mechanics being introduced alongside it. At first, the main benefits it brings are added moves to your combos that work best when surrounded by enemies, though a bit further in, you get to also switch up the model of Dahak you're using. What this does is with each different model of the Dahak, they all have different unique moves and stats. For instance, the Type S you start with has those combo add-ons and a focus on attack. Outside of that, there's one that focuses on hydraulics and lets you grab things better, there's one that focuses on defense and lets you parry attacks at the cost of being slower, and then there's one that makes you faster overall at the cost of defense. Honestly, as much as the attack and hydraulics focused ones were neat, the one I ended up gravitating towards the most was the speed form. With it in general taking more damage, the devs unknowingly created an answer to one of my gripes with the combat. A lot of it is still not the hardest, but having to actually be careful about your health again made it more engaging for me. Plus, being faster overall was great for traversing areas. Next to all of that, there's also the new trance mechanic in combat. Now that Red can actually control it, when the trance gauge is filled up through performing combos and defeating enemies, you can activate it for a short span of time. Aside from it being pretty cool, the only real thing it brings to the table are some projectiles Red can shoot in the form. I guess in theory it's good to deal some instant damage if you're in a pinch, but with Solatorobo rarely pushing me to that point, I didn't find many instances where I felt motivated to use it. Still, these are decent additions to the combat that add some needed variety. Even if I settled on the speed form, it was fun experimenting with all four. So back to the plot, after taking down Nero with her own projectiles, we're back at the Golden Roar for the next round of insane plot twists. As it turns out, Merveille wasn't just assisting the man who created all the hybrids, she directly provided her own genetics to the project, making her Red's mother in a sense. For a character that committed so many horrible acts, the way Solatorobo portrays her with a firm passion for making up for it all was pretty compelling. And as for Bion, the man she worked with, his origins take this plot into an entirely new direction. To preface this, all the way back in Tail Concerto's opening, it was stated that the world of these games was once inhabited by a vastly advanced civilization that disappeared. They were the ones that created the Titano Machina, like Laurus and Lemurus from Solatorobo or the Iron Giant from Tail Concerto. Well, as it turns out, Bion is not only the original hybrid, he's one of the last remaining remnants of the old world, Earth. Yup, that's right. All this time, Solatorobo's setting was post-apocalyptic, and beneath the deadly cloud sea that stretches out beneath the Sky Islands lies the ruined remnants of humanity's planet. Now I know what you're thinking, doesn't this twist sound literally exactly like another twist from a certain big JRPG? I'm not gonna specify what game, as that'd be spoiling it big time, but with this coming out before it, there's no way those devs didn't play Solatorobo. I'd already guessed things were gonna get crazy, with human-like beings coming into the plot, but my god, who could have seen this story going in this direction? I thought I was just in for a fun little mech game. I had no idea I'd entered the furries commit war crimes timeline. Believe it or not, things continued to get crazier from here. With the overall goal of the plot now being to get down to Earth somehow to get information on Tartarus, this next segment is a mix between going to new and old areas. Starting with a new area, Red and crew go to Mao. Unlike all the Sky Islands so far, Mao goes for an entirely different style. Its windy climate, paired with the hanging village and upside-down wolf statues, made for one of the prettiest locales in the game. This works in the game's favor too, as you'll be spending a bit of time here going through its obstacle courses. Further into Mao, Red and L learn that the only way to get past the Cloud Sea is to assemble a certain flute to summon a massive creature that can take them there. And to do that, Red has to take on 3 guardians who protect said flute. The first one isn't all that special, but to give credit where credit is due, the second guardian puts up a bit of a fight. Like the first, the only way to damage the second guardian is by throwing its projectiles back at it. The only problem is, with them coming out so fast, my crappy reaction time didn't do me any favors. I'd go so far to say that at least in my playthrough, this was one of the hardest fights in the game. Then with the final guardian in one of the last new areas of the game, there's the Sky Island of Sealyham. Possibly taking the cake for one of my favorite locations in the game, Sealyham continues the trend set by Mao by being vastly different to other locations. I'm a big fan of how it's all designed as if the island was underwater. As Sealyham also has its own portion for Red to fly around in, this underwater vibe only enhanced it. What a spectacle for a DS game! With the final guardian here, while it isn't a boss fight, Blanc shows up and is. Touting a mech and having similar mechanics to Nero, this fight is much more involved, as he likes to bait you into picking up projectiles only to then attack while your guard is down. Definitely a well-designed fight, those charge attacks of his almost had me on the ropes. Afterwards, taking the gigantic whale summoned by the flute down to the Earth's surface, it's time for even more insane info dumps. Ever since they dropped the game changer that this game's world was actually a post-humanity Earth, I'd been anticipating all sorts of crazy ruins to be below the Cloud Sea. So to see that aside from a single ancient tower, there was nothing but bleak ocean sets a pretty grim tone. Humanity must have not had a very nice end for the very continents themselves to be gone. Remember how I said before that this game has lore? Well, get ready for a lot of it. Known as the Futzu Tower back when people were still around, this tower sits on top of a small bit of land that at one point was part of Australia. On top of that, it was also Australia where a hidden piece of highly advanced alien technology would be discovered, the Hyper-Energy Convergence Juno. From this first Juno, which the Futzu Tower would be built around, humanity would gain technology beyond their wildest dreams, with practically all modern problems being solved as a result. Although, what appeared to be a civilization-advancing miracle would prove to be too much for immature humanity. Congrats, Australians! How does it feel knowing your country held the key to our destruction? As a result of such sudden and rapid innovation, economies collapsed, with old fuel sources becoming obsolete. And with only a certain number of Juno existing, certain countries would also try to hoard the information given by them, all culminating in a planet-shaking war. Because alongside providing technology for clean fuel and such versatile devices like nanomachines, the Juno also contained the capability to create Titano Machina. Thus, after World War III broke out and was set to lead to all life on Earth being extinguished, the scientists at the Futzu Tower had to make a tough decision. With there being no way of stopping the war amicably, the Juno at Futzu Tower was allowed to activate the Reset command. Once activated, the Juno assimilated all life on Earth into data and literally remade the surface through lifting every continent into the sky. After they blanketed the planet in a coat of plasma clouds beneath the floating continents, life would then be remade through the data they'd absorbed, this resulting in the current residents of the Sky Islands today. In an effort to keep history from repeating itself, each of the 53 Juno except that first one in Australia would then shift to adjacent dimensions until they are needed once more. Wow, that's a lot to take in. I remember when I was playing through this myself, I had to just sit and think for a moment about how much this game has escalated. There's only a couple JRPGs I can think of that have caught me so off guard. You know, maybe it shouldn't be that shocking that when all's said and done, it's furries that outlive us all. In this universe, Solatorobo must have been a smash hit for CyberConnect to have their logo inside the tower. It's also in this scene where we learn the true goals of Bion. Upon summoning the Juno Tartarus, he plans to activate a specific program it contains called Coda. Once activated, Coda returns all the floating islands under a set Juno's purview back to the ocean where they originally were, along with each of the Juno returning from their alternate dimensions. Under normal circumstances, this would only be done when the Australian Juno Yerlunger deemed the current civilization ready to return to Earth's surface and have contact with the Juno. The problem is, without the elimination of the plasma clouds, doing this would kill everything that lived on said islands. In fact, Bion was one of many hybrids that were only set to awaken after the normal activation of Coda, and as if on cue, it's at this point that Bion sneaks into the Futzu Tower for the last thing he needed to forcibly drag Tartarus into this dimension. It's interesting, with Bion, you can really tell he doesn't believe anything he's doing is wrong. After all, considering his entire purpose was to awaken when it was time to bring about Coda, he's only doing what he was designed to do. He's still incredibly reprehensible with his complete disregard for life, but he's also pretty tragic in a way. Ideally, Bion was supposed to awake only when the current civilization had matured beyond what humanity was at their end, so to see the mistakes of humanity repeated must have destroyed him. Now that the return of Tartarus is unavoidable, the main and final goal of the plot becomes stopping Coda before it's activated. From here, things begin to accelerate at a very rapid pace. In this last segment before the finale, each of the characters have to carry out a complex mission to take over both Titano Machina to stop Tartarus and still somehow protect people in the meantime. The fact that Tartarus is just an immense featureless golden orb almost makes it more menacing. You'd expect some kind of massive mech that dwarfs even Laris, but with it looking so unnatural and out of place, I feel that design choice only enhanced the apocalyptic feel it gives off. And before they're able to take control of Laris and Lemurus, there's the final showdown with Blanc and Nero. In this fight, a side quest mechanic actually makes its way into the main story, as you have to shoot their mech with a turret. All things considered, this fight isn't the hardest, though they did trip me up a few times as I kept neglecting to shoot down the projectiles. The highlight for me here had to be the fusion of Blanc and Nero's mechs. What an incredibly sick design! And after that fight, things once again become seriously heavy. You see, as Blanc and Nero were perfect beings designed to operate the Titano Machina only one time, by this point they'd already served their purpose, unlike Red, who while technically a failure, is free from such duties. Much like how Bion was intended to serve a specific purpose upon Coda's activation, Blanc and Nero are nothing more than sentient tools. It's really chilling seeing them forced to confront this fact. They've been so brainwashed that the only thing left to look forward to in life for them is the new order they expected to be issued from Tartarus. So when Tartarus sends out the order to destroy all life, they don't receive it properly due to their purpose already being fulfilled. Instead, it's Red that receives it as he becomes controlled by the program within Tartarus. For characters that were just about as awful as you can be throughout the story, I will give Solatorobo props for making me feel bad for them as they met their end right as they had been freed from anyone's control. Knowing how much Red fears hurting those dear to him, I didn't expect this game to go so far as to have him essentially kill them. What's worse, while under the influence of the Order, Red almost ends up choking out L. After the game spent most of its time developing these two to the point of them beginning to harbor romantic feelings for one another, that look of horror on Red's face once he snapped out of it hit me hard. In a way, both L and Red's arcs kind of mirror one another, as they both have to confront and overcome horrific things instilled into them. That core theme throughout Solatorobo does a lot for making this game what it is. So after coming to his senses, the only things left to do for Red are to infiltrate Lemurus, then Tartarus itself. Mostly being similar to Laris, the main difference with Lemurus is the boss fight at the end. Honestly, there's not that much to it aside from dealing with some feisty shades. The real attraction here is Tartarus, as every character good and bad comes together to help Red break through Tartarus' shields and save life itself. Now, I'm no stranger to scenes like this where everyone comes together in support of a protagonist, but Solatorobo definitely has one of my favorites. Just seeing all the airships you've seen throughout the game bombard Tartarus in this awesome cutscene was a real treat. What's more, upon entering Tartarus, the Dahak gets powered up by the remaining essence of Blancanero into the Septentrion, easily the coolest mech design in the entire game. And fitting this new mech, Solatorobo introduces a new flying segment at the last minute where you shoot down shades on the way to Bion. Much like the design of Tartarus itself, the environment within it is even more bizarre, as it makes you feel like you're getting closer to confronting a god. In fact, the core of Tartarus evokes this even more. Then, in the final confrontation between Red and what's technically his father, Bion's outlook becomes far clearer. In an effort to cope with his premature awakening, Bion is kind of like a square peg doing its best to fit into a round hole. So much so that in trying to find purpose in his premature awakening, Bion's developed the delusion that the Earth itself awoke him in order to rid the planet of what he deems are failures. Because in truth, Bion would never be satisfied with any civilization. No matter what, a hallmark of intelligent life is making mistakes and learning from them, whether it be on their own or through the help of others. The fatal flaw with Bion's logic is humanity can't be compared to the Felineko and K9 that came after. While yes, the two share innumerable characteristics, what drove humanity to their doom wasn't their inherent traits, it was the Juno themselves that unknowingly destabilized societies and halted progress. Due to Bion being a sentient tool just like the hybrids he created, he can't comprehend why others wouldn't follow suit and submit to being nothing more than robots who follow commands. It's only when Red explains how he himself overcame obstacles despite being a failure that Bion on some level finally understood. This right here, man, this is why I love this game so much. The characters, the world building, the conflict, everything resulting in this final message was done so well. Not to neglect the final boss, that is, as it can be pretty hectic as far as Solatorobo's combat has been so far. Like I'd come to learn after getting thoroughly slapped around, staying still is a bad idea here with all the attacks that'll chase you. If anything, I wish there were more fights like this in-game where the enemy actively pursues you. It was probably one of the only fights that managed to have me on edge. While Bion is absolutely still one of the worst dads ever, it was pretty heartwarming to see Red get some closure with Bion at last acknowledging his efforts and wishes. So with the world saved and Tartarus returning to its isolation in another dimension, Solatorobo comes to a close. Conveniently, operating the Titano Machina drained El and Beluga's energy so much that now they're mortal like everyone else. If only there was just a bit more game left to see these characters happily living their lives. Something I've always wanted out of many RPGs I've played is a proper post-game to see how all the characters are doing after the finale. Granted, in more recent times, I can think of some games that have done exactly this wonderfully, but growing up, I'd always be bummed out that after beating the final boss, loading my game again would always take me to right before the game's finale. Well, thankfully, Solatorobo gets me since there's post-game quests. Dwarfing the little post-game segment they squeezed into Tail Concerto, after beating the game, there's some new side quests that each focus on a different group of characters from the game. In fact, at the time of Solatorobo's Japanese release, these weren't even included in the game. It was only after the fact that these would come out as free DLC, the US version just coming packaged with them. If by some anomaly you still weren't convinced about the dedication these devs had to Solatorobo, this shows it better than anything. All these little quests are great, from characters from Tail Concerto getting one last hurrah to characters like Opera getting fleshed out further, but I'll be focusing on the ones that left the most impact on me. Back at the Golden Roar, a good number of the post-game side quests are hidden away here. And just like how the simulation portion of the plot was one of the highlights of the game, these new rounds of simulations live up to that and then some. You know how for much of the video I've been critiquing this game for its combat not having much challenge? Well, this post-game boss rush you unlock here made me eat my words. Even with my upgraded mech that I packed full of hydraulics and attack, fighting all these back to back without a single heal pushed me to my limits. Thankfully, the boss rush is split into 2 for each part of the game, or else I'm not sure if I'd have been able to beat it. That Fish Guardian boss in the second boss rush destroyed so many of my runs. Then, in a side quest focusing on Merveille, it was really nice to see the game have her make up for and come to terms with the horrible things she did in the past. The main story had a fair amount of that too, but for such a complicated character, she definitely deserved the spotlight, at least for a bit. Plus, it gives closure to Blanc and Nero, who as it turns out, actually lived on somewhat as data within the Dahak. Bion may be a contender for World's Worst Dad, but thankfully, Merveille is doing her best to keep from becoming World's Worst Mom. Though by far my favorite out of these new simulation quests has to be this one with Elle and Red, because after the game building their relationship up bit by bit for practically the whole plot, there's finally some payoff with them revealing their feelings for each other. It may not be as complex as that last one was, with it displaying the depths of Merveille's regrets, but man if I don't have a soft spot for sappy stuff like this. Even if Red forgets everything from the simulation after the fact, the game confirming that they do in fact share feelings for one another was all I really needed. So now, once you've taken care of all the normal and post-game quests available, there's one more left that really ties everything together. On the surface, it seems pretty similar to other quests you've done throughout the game, with the goal of helping the orphans at Bassett make an origami crane chain. Cute and simple, right? Well, in actuality, it was all just an excuse to have Red make the rounds to nearly every location in-game to have almost all the characters you've met contribute cranes for the orphanage. No matter whether they were integral to the plot or just a side character that appeared in a few quests, this whole segment was such a great send-off for them all. It really makes the whole experience that much more rewarding, as all the characters you've helped the entire time help you out in turn. In the end, when all the cranes are gathered, there's another meaning behind this all as well. While the Shepherd Republic and general world at large is still far from Bion's idea of paradise, the fact that Red was able to get all sorts to come together on such a grand scale shows that bit by bit, that paradise will be achievable one day. And once all the cranes are released into the sky with the wishes of everyone who made them, even your Lunger down on the Futzu Tower realizes that maybe it won't be that long until the current societies on the floating islands have matured enough for the true coda to be activated. Not the murderous plan Bion wanted to enact, but the one that was planned all along to safely bring the continent back down once everyone was ready to have access to Juno. In my humble opinion, I don't believe the game could have ended off on a better note. From start to finish, Solatorobo quickly went from an upbeat adventure to an absolutely enthralling story. I'm genuinely not sure if I've ever seen a game carried by its plot to this extent. To think that this game is as good as it is, despite certain planned sections being cut due to development issues. Most notably, the devs had planned on Elle being playable during a flashback segment in the destruction of her home, a ragdoll. Luckily, some of these would come to fruition in the form of light novels released after the game came out. They're definitely worth a read if you enjoyed the story and its characters. Even with the battle system, while I've levied a fair share of criticisms towards it, there was rarely a point where I outright didn't enjoy it. I can understand people disagreeing with me here, but to me, as long as a game remains fun, it's not that big of a deal if it's not that challenging. There's barely any consequences to getting damaged in Kirby's Epic Yarn, yet I still love that game for all of its fun gameplay decisions. At the end of the day, even with its flaws, Solatorobo would go on to become not just one of the best DS hidden gems for me, but one of the best DS games period. And I don't say that lightly. Which makes it all the more sad that after being released, Solatorobo would share the fate of Tail Concerto with around the same amount of sales. It's really frustrating too, because this wasn't just because of the usual reasons of garbage reviewers and coming out too late in the system's lifespan. Sure, both of those were factors sadly, though personally, I feel the choices made in advertising this game were so detrimental to its sales, it's almost comical. Believe it or not, in Japan, Bandai Namco decided that it'd be a good idea to create, and I'm not making this up, 100 different 16-second commercials, each with different details about about the game, some of which contained critical spoilers for the second half. And here's the kicker, instead of advertising like normal, all of these 100 commercials would only air for a single day during an 8-hour period to try and break a Guinness World Record. Like, my god, at least spread out how you air them instead of packing them all into a single day. If not for that, this impressive feat might have just worked out. It's like they preferred making a world record over properly promoting Solatorobo. Things didn't fare much better for the West either, where much of the advertising was focused on gaming magazines. Keep in mind, this was 2011 when gaming magazines were well on their way out. I don't know who thought this was a good idea. It's almost impressive that it did as well as it did, with so many factors working against it. The biggest tragedy of all is the lack of any way to buy the game nowadays to support the devs. Though actually, that's not entirely true. In reality, there's a way you can support the devs of Solatorobo right now. Enter Fuga Melodies of Steel, a turn-based RPG set in the same universe except 700 years before the events of Solatorobo. Now, at first, I wasn't planning on playing this before making this video, but once I started, I found it increasingly hard to put down. I'm not gonna spoil a single thing, but all I'll say is if you played Solatorobo and became invested in its lore, you'll enjoy this one a lot. I'm actually gonna avoid going into the lore book released after Solatorobo for that reason, as a lot of the info in there is getting localized for Fuga. The game's take on turn-based battles was really fun too. I found myself in serious trouble a good number of times. In fact, there couldn't be a better time to play these games, as it's already been confirmed that Fuga Melodies of Steel is just the first entry in what will be a trilogy of games. The second one has already been announced for this year, so it's time for this series to finally get the success and recognition it's long deserved. Seriously, go get Fuga now. So there you have it. What started as me wanting to try out this little obscure DS game people have recommended led me down a rabbit hole into what turned out to be a series dating back to the late 90s. Without a doubt, they've made a fan out of me, and after the hours upon hours of enjoyment I got out of Solatorobo and later Fuga for that matter, I can't wait to see what's in store next. Well, that video became a whole lot longer than I expected. After seeing how underappreciated Solatorobo was in contrast to its quality, I had to make sure to do this game right no matter what. I hope you all enjoyed it. And before I get to the patrons, I do have a bit of an update regarding yours truly. I recorded this prior to it, but on the 23rd of January, I'll be going in for jaw surgery to correct my underbite. It's something I've been planning for a long time, so I'm pretty happy it's finally happening. The thing is, it's very likely that I won't be able to do much on this channel or anywhere for a bit as I recover, so apologies in advance for the hiatus. At the time of recording this, I only have video editing left to do, so hopefully it didn't take me too long to finish the video. Let me know if you'd all be interested in seeing me upload something like a highlight reel of one of my streams in the meantime. I won't be able to record for some time, but I'd probably be able to hold you all over until my next video with that. I definitely have a few candidates in mind that you'd all be interested in. And hey, there's also my streams archived on the VOD channel if you're interested in those. Regardless, I appreciate you all sticking with me here. It's gonna be one hectic year. Above all else, I'd like to thank Jack Corvus and the rest of my patrons on Patreon. If you want to support what I do and get some bonus content like early cuts of videos before they release and behind the scenes videos, do consider stopping by patreon.com/therpgmonger. By the way, while I do have plans to start experimenting a bit more with my videos this year, do feel free to recommend other games like this to me. I'm always in the market for more solid hidden gems like this. So that being said, I'm the RPG Monger, and don't forget that each and every one of you are fantastic.